So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Deborah Dinosaur here. First, I want to say, if I sound funny, I'm sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat. Also, apparently, there's a cricket in the house, so I'm going to try and cut as much of that out as I can, but who knows, it might show up anyway. Anyway, we're coming back to Randy Galuza after a commercial break. Before the break, he was telling us that he has a new idea about how organisms adapt. He says it's organism-centered, not environment-centered, and that it's all about internal engineered systems inside organisms that sense the environment and induce changes. We already know he's wrong and have known that since the 1940s, but let's see what he's got for us.
Randy, before the break, you said that there were two features of CET. One of them is that we look at the internal of the creature. What's the second?
I'm still not clear on what he really means by the first feature, but okay, I guess we're just moving on.
The second is that we treat creatures as if they really were engineered.
I'm curious as to what difference that will make. It won't really change the details of, say, biomechanics or biochemistry, but hey, maybe for the first time ever, Randy will have a clear answer for us that doesn't rely on vague nothing.
In other words, continuous environmental tracking is an engineering-based approach to the creatures, which is very, very different than obviously Darwin's anti-design based. So as we're looking at the picture here on the screen, we're talking about adaptation, and we see a car which has adaptable features. One of them is cruise control.
Except that cruise control is something that a user has to use and control, and unlike living things, populations of cars don't reproduce and adapt to new environments over generations. No matter how long a bunch of cars drive around the Arctic, they're not going to grow snow chains or a better heater. Populations of organisms do things like that, though. Polar bears grow fur on their feet instead of having bare toe pads. They also grow clear fur that in bulk looks white, unlike other bears. We can't explain that by the same mechanism as a whole current speed function in a truck.
And in order for that car to stay at the constant speed, it has to have a speed sensor. It has to have some internal programming that says if the speed begins to slow down, then push on the throttle. And it has to have an output response. We're going to see creatures with the exact same type of engineering, that they have sensors, that they have internal programming, and they have very, very specific targeted output responses.
But again, Randy is failing to differentiate his idea from the predictions of evolutionary theory. Evolution also says that organisms will sense their environment and perform behaviors that respond to environmental stimuli in appropriate ways. We all agree about this. There's no real difference here, except that Randy is introducing a design which is not in evidence as his explanation.
And it is these type of engineering principles, as we look at creatures, which are going to guide us as we move forward. And this has some very important implications.
I really wonder what those are, since so far he hasn't managed to actually differentiate his predictions from those of evolution, except that by invoking an omnipotent actor, he's removed them from the realm of being easily tested. And in the one case so far in the last episode where we could make a test, that is whether mutations are induced or stochastic, Randy's idea seems to have been falsified. Of course, he can just say that God interfered with the Luria-Delbruck experiment to trick atheists or something.
Because we can look at creatures as if they're engineered, we can make some pretty good predictions. First of all, we can predict that a man-made thing and a God-made thing that are doing similar functions, that have similar functions, we can predict that they might have similar operating systems to produce those functions, and that those systems will have similar elements.
Okay, but there's a very obvious problem with that. These similar functions have to deal with the same laws of nature. Animals don't get to have their own bespoke physics for each organism. There are only so many ways to do a certain task, like regulate temperature, swim, run, perceive chemicals, or perceive light. All possible explanations for life that don't involve magic make this same prediction.
So the car on the left-hand side of the screen has all kinds of sensors, and it can drive itself from Los Angeles to New York City because it can detect what's happening in the environment and go around those different conditions.
Except that, no, it can't. No car can do that. This is a picture of an entrant from a DARPA autonomous vehicle competition in 2007. The whole thing took place on the streets of a closed military base because none of the cars could be trusted on the roads with pedestrians and traffic. All of them were tailed by a manned car with a kill switch, most of which had to have the kill switch used. They all stopped at random times and got confused by what their sensors were showing them, and the goal of this challenge was to facilitate all battlefield vehicles fielded by the United States of America being autonomous by 2015. 9 years later, that goal hasn't been met, and as far as I know, the USA fields no automatic vehicles in combat. This doesn't much matter to Randy's point, near as I can tell, but it's just weird that he would lie about this.
And then you see on the right-hand side of the screen, it says that guinea pigs can beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA. Well, how in the world would they do that?
Specifically, they do it through DNA methylation. Randy is referencing a New Scientist article that itself is reporting on the paper Paternal Intergenerational Epigenetic Response to Heat Exposure in Male Wild Guinea Pigs by Alexandra Wyrick et al., published December 19, 2015 in the journal Molecular Ecology. They found that methylation levels around the genes that produce heat shock proteins differed between the control group and the experimental group. Methylation is something that occurs to DNA, and essentially, a methyl functional group is attached to the DNA by a protein, which then causes that region of DNA to become more or less unavailable for transcription, thus deactivating that region. About 45% of the human genome is methylated in bulk and contains things like repetitive DNA elements and viral DNA. These are methylated because if they are expressed, they tend to cause disruption to the rest of the genome. On a side note, this makes about 45% of the genome something we know to not just be non-functional, but to be positively harmful if activated. So much for there being no junk DNA, as creationists like to tell us. So in the guinea pig, various genes were either methylated or demethylated during the experiment. But to quote the article that Randy is citing, these epigenetic responses may help organisms cope, but they won't make them adapt more quickly, says team member Jorns Fickel, because they don't affect the DNA sequence. Instead, they might buy a species time to evolve permanent adaptations to a warmer climate. So even according to Randy's source, this is not a long-term adaptive ability. It's a way to get by modest or short-term warming.
If these creatures can live in hot environments, how might they do that? Well, this was an experiment. This is a great example where they took these guinea pigs.
I want to point out that Randy is showing a domesticated guinea pig on screen, but the experiment was conducted on wild-type guinea pigs. It's not really a big deal, but it does give a somewhat incorrect impression, and I want to correct that.
And they put them under a hot condition for the entire time it makes for one cycle of sperm. Then they mated these male guinea pigs with female guinea pigs, which had not been under hot conditions. And lo and behold, in one generation, the offspring were able to live in hotter conditions, and they had self-adjusted their own DNA.
But it wasn't them being able to live in a hotter environment they could live in before. We can tell because their fathers could live in that environment. Further, one of the things we need to be clear about when discussing this is the fact that the sequence of the DNA has not changed. Epigenetic changes like methylation do not change the sequence of the DNA, which means that any adaptation that is detected in the sequence of the DNA cannot be explained this way. An example is canine amylase genes. Amylase is an enzyme that helps break down complex carbohydrates so that they can be digested. Domesticated dogs vary in their number of copies of the amylase gene, but generally they have significantly more than seen in wild wolves. This is pretty obviously an adaptation to living off a diet provided by humans, who themselves tend to eat a lot of starch, which is why humans also have a lot of amylase genes. So in order for dogs to get these amylase genes, something beyond just epigenetic changes must have occurred. There must have been whole gene duplication mutations that occurred more than once in most dog lineages. How does Randy account for this? Certainly this experiment does not help, as no mutations were induced, and further the Luria-Delbruck experiment indicates that such mutations are not caused by the environment, whether it involves input from the animal or not. Instead, the mutations occur stochastically, and then the environment is the filter that determines which mutations will persist and which will perish. Of course, genetic drift also matters, but because we're focused on adaptation and drift is generally non-adaptive, I will largely not be dealing with it.
So there was an adaptability built into this creature that when the circumstances changes, it wouldn't have done anything if there wasn't already this ability within the creature. And I think that's the thing that really the evolutionists are overlooking.
Evolutionists, eh? Let us pray. Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come, thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen. How are the evolutionists ignoring this when they're the ones who wrote the paper? Like, what does he think is going on here?
So the environment might change, but you put nothing in the creature and it doesn't respond. How could something outside a creature make something in it?
I don't even understand this question. The animal cells have proteins that transport methyl groups to the DNA, and some of them are activated by heat. What was supposed to be put in the organism? The proteins? They were already there.
That's exactly right. It doesn't happen that way.
What doesn't happen what way? Randy is the world champion of saying lots of words and meaning nothing. Okay, it might actually be Nathaniel Hawthorne, but Randy is in number 2. Yeah, I know he's considered one of the great authors of the American canon, but let's just say I read The Scarlet Letter by only reading the first line of a paragraph, and if nothing actually happened in that paragraph, I skipped it entirely. I only read the full paragraph if any action occurred in the first line. I got an A on all my tests about the book, which to me tells me that far more than half that book doesn't need to exist. No, I have no idea why I decided to take a moment to complain that I don't like a book I was forced to read in high school. That, while it contained important themes about moralism, forgiveness, and oppression, was an absolute slog to get through. Sometimes I just need a break from the creationism to complain about something else. Feel free to tell me how wrong I am and how it's the most riveting book ever.
Which brings us to the next really important point. Boy, what a great setup for that. That engineered adaptability is an upfront capability.
Engineers don't like to go in the back door. Got it.
In other words, as it says there at the bottom, solutions precede the challenges.
Superficially, that sounds a whole lot like the mutations that provide an advantage under natural selection existing because of random mutation, which, is the basic adaptive mechanism of the theory of evolution. But let's let him cook a bit more.
So if you and I were engineers and we're going to design a space shuttle to go into space, we would brainstorm, along with a lot of other people, all of the challenges that it's going to face as it goes through all these different environments, and we would build upfront the solutions to those challenges before we ever put a person in that space shuttle. And those astronauts want us to build the solutions before they face the challenges.
Okay, but the fact that engineers do a thing, and that you think that therefore God did a similar thing, doesn't mean that that's what happened. That's a hypothesis to test.
Evolution says that the solutions are due to the challenges.
But they're also due to mutations that occur regardless of the challenges. Ignoring one half of the theory just means you're not criticizing the theory, you're criticizing a straw man version of it.
So when we go with an engineer-based approach, we begin to look at creatures in entirely different ways. And we can begin to contrast what we're beginning to say and what we're beginning to talk about with what Darwin has been teaching us.
So, you got any of those testable predictions that aren't the same as evolutionary biology then? Those are kind of important if you want to throw out the current unifying model of biology.
It's interesting. Scientists don't just shoot rockets into space over and over again, expecting that the different environments to change the rocket and then studying that.
That's because rockets don't reproduce and mutate based on how good a rocket they are. But you can design a rocket with a genetic algorithm that simulates what would happen if a rocket could reproduce and its offspring could mutate. In fact, a simplified version of this can be seen in a little web applet called Smart Rockets. Simplified rocket actors attempt to hit a target with the barriers in the way that they have to avoid. Their code controls where they will go by steering them. In the first few generations, many of them will crash into the ground and most of the rest will crash into the first barrier. But after a dozen or two generations, many of them will be able to get past the first barrier, and eventually the majority will hit the target. Feel free to run it yourself. Now, this isn't nearly as complex as a genetic algorithm to design a real rocket, but that's because it has to run in your browser. In fact, genetic algorithms are all over the place, and they can teach random code to accomplish tasks, like beating video games, walking in a realistic physics simulation, or even flying rockets. You do not need to pre-program these programs for them to accomplish tasks. You just need a fitness function and a way to randomly vary the code of the most fit versions of the program. This is because, as it has been said, if you have reproduction with mutation and some kind of fitness function, evolution by natural selection is a mathematical inevitability, and all Randy is doing is pissing in the wind of mathematical certainty.
There's a sense in which the science that we have that's been successful, whether it be in technology or medicine or anything else,
which, let's remember, includes evolution and also genetic algorithms that use the process of evolution by natural selection in non-biological contexts.
They're already sort of assuming this, right? They're already thinking in terms of, well, we have to put it in the creature.
Right.
Already, whether it's the spaceship or the body, in terms of medicine or something like that, they're already assuming that it's what's inside the creature that counts. It's not the environment that's going to make.
No, it's both. The environment is the filter for what is in both designed and non-designed things, and that filter will act on pre-existing things. One of the things to remember is that rockets didn't work well when they were first invented. The early Chinese rockets could only be vaguely aimed and had virtually no accuracy. That's why they were fired in batteries for fire saturation in military applications. They would go downrange, but they couldn't hit particular targets outside of a huge number hitting a large area that includes the target. Even in World War II, where the Germans were the ones to make the most significant refinements, the early versions of their rockets routinely failed. It was the environment that provided the criteria that engineers needed to figure out how to make better rockets. The difference between this and evolution is not that the environment provides a filter. The difference is that in one case, an intelligent agent makes the changes, and in the other, the changes occur regardless, without any purposefulness, and some of them are improvements.
You're right. They're assuming all of that, but they're giving the environment the credit.
No one is standing up and giving an acceptance speech thanking the environment. The environment plays the same role in evolution as it does in engineering. It's the thing that provides the conditions for success or failure, and the options that are not compatible with the environment will not persist in either engineering or evolution. This is just Randy hating on his imagined attribution of personhood to the environment. I know he hasn't really gotten there yet, but I've seen him give this presentation at least 2 other times now.
So as we wrap up here, we can actually contrast these 2 different approaches. First of all, Darwin sees organism as non-design, and he sees that they're operating under random adaptive processes, because his random view and his random approach is the opposite of what an engineer would actually do.
Except when they design things by genetic algorithm. Now, not many things are designed that way, but it does happen. For example, the 2006 NASA ST-5 antenna was designed by evolutionary algorithm. It was successfully used by NASA, and other similarly designed by algorithm antennas were used on lunar missions by NASA. Even engineers don't work the way Randy thinks they do, at least not in all cases.
And it's externalistic. And these are actually quotes from evolutionary literature. He sees passive organisms shaped by the vicissitudes of nature, and that adaptation would be characterized as undirected, copious in extent, or in other words, hit and miss and trial and error, and he sees that the changes would be iterative, gradual, and linear, or as Darwin said himself, numerous, successive, slight modifications.
And that's by and large what we see in nature, at least with the caveat that gradual and slow are context dependent.
What we want to do is we want to replace that altogether, lock, stock, and barrel, with an approach which is designed and sees adaptation as very, very purposeful. And so it's the exact opposite.
Someday, Randy will propose a mechanism for this, right?
Of what Darwin said. It's an internalistic approach where we see active organisms shaping themselves to solve problems.
4 words come to mind. The Luria-Delbruck experiment. We've known Randy is wrong about this for 80 years.
We see adaptation characterized as it really is in the literature, highly regulated, with targeted solutions that are predictable if need be, and that changes can be variable in extent.
And so far, our only example is epigenetic change in guinea pigs that the article Randy himself cited said couldn't be a mechanism for long-term adaptation to climate change. His own source contradicts him.
Whatever they need to be, if they need to be faster or slower, the organism has mechanisms which can detect those things and adjust itself.
In many cases, yes, epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity can allow for an individual organism to overcome new environmental conditions, but that is not sufficient to account for the adaptation we actually see, because neither of these mechanisms cause any change in the actual genetic sequence, yet we observe adaptive traits tied to actual changes to the DNA. So Randy's mechanisms, as he's proposed them so far, are already known to be insufficient.
This slide is very important for everybody who's watching us. It contrasts Darwin's approach, which is like the anti-designer approach, with a designer approach. And Lord willing, at our next program, we'll talk about some more of those types of adaptations.
I know Randy is talking like the show's about to end, and from his perspective, that is true. But I cut the 2 shows together into one, so that we can have a seamless transition. But I have to say that given how little was said in the first show, he probably should have just not bothered and jumped right into the second show. Of course, that's on the assumption that the second show will actually have anything worthwhile, which, based on his performance so far, I very much doubt.
Well, I can't wait until you're back and we can do that, because
he could have done it today instead of just waffling on about nothing and lying about a car. Like, that was never a thing he was required to do.
Just what we've talked about today, it's not only the way we function as human beings in everything we do. When we see a problem, we as we've talked about. We look at what we need to do internally to make something or to put something in ourselves, medicine, food, whatever, to give us the result.
You know, Randy normally doesn't like people imputing personhood onto impersonal things, but it seems like Ray is doing that to all organisms, and because he can pretend that it's because of God in some ill-defined manner, Randy suddenly doesn't really care. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'm reading too much into this. I'll admit, I don't have a lot of charity for Randy.
And we do that, and yet what scientists are doing, what evolution scientists are doing is saying, well, that shouldn't work. What we should just throwing random stuff at ourselves or at a problem, and eventually the environment will allow the right one to thrive, and then it will reproduce itself,
Which, let's remember, has produced working deep space antennas for NASA, so we know it does work, because it has worked in the past.
really kind of boggles the mind that anybody would hold on to that. But I think there's an underlying reason.
Yeah, that it demonstrably works, not just in biology, but even in engineering. Evolution produces results in multiple areas.
Hello and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heipel, and it's an honor to be your host today.
Hello again, Ray. It's a weird feeling to still be here. I'm hoping that there's some actual content that could at least support Randy's idea.
During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science along with other important facts.
But also Randy Gluza, who doesn't do any of that.
Validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Randy Gluza, has undergraduate degrees in engineering and theology. He has earned an MD and also a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. Dr. Gluza is a registered professional engineer. In 2008, he retired as lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Air Force.
So, still no credentials in evolutionary biology. Got it. He's not even pretending. At least Kent Hovind pretends to have relevant credentials. Randy is just proud to not know what he's talking about.
Now he's the president of the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas, Texas.
It's downright embarrassing.
It's yeah, as we've said, pathetic and embarrassing.
Pathetic and embarrassing.
Welcome to the program, Dr. Gluza.
Thank you, Ray.
This is part 2 of a 2-part program, and in the first part, we
accomplished essentially nothing.
Began to look at CET, continuous environmental tracking.
No, we didn't. We looked at some epigenetics, which according to Randy's own source is insufficient to explain adaptation in organisms over time. All that happened was that Randy waffled on and provided one Trojan source.
Can you remind us what that is?
Oh, yes, I'd love to. Continuous environmental tracking is actually an engineering-based approach to explain how organisms adapt.
One that, let's remember, is so useless and vague and contrary to the evidence that even all other creationists who don't work for ICR have rejected it. Randy is too wrong even for the other creationists.
As Paul Nelson says right here, doing it as if Darwin had not been born. We're doing biology in a completely different way. We're going back to a Bible-based approach where
epigenetics is somehow able to induce mutations in contrast to what we actually know from experiment. It's rather amazing how at every turn continuous environmental tracking means more or less nothing, and on the rare occasion where something concrete is said about it, it immediately contradicts itself. This is a big part of why it gains no traction. With CET, there's no there. There's no real idea, and what inklings of actual thought appear are immediately seen to be completely incoherent anyway.
we see, and as we discussed last time from Romans chapter 1, verse 20, we see the evidences of engineering inside of these creatures.
But only by the power of question begging.
And what we're actually looking there is at that phrase that says they're understood by the things that have made, as we discussed last time. That word made could actually be translated as workmanship.
How much Hebrew do you think Randy knows? Let me know in the comments. I think he knows less than I do, and I know almost none. I probably know fewer than 100 words in Hebrew. I can't conjugate verbs, and I don't even remember all the prepositions. I bet Randy knows fewer than a dozen Hebrew words and can't recognize the letters in the Hebrew abjad. In case you're wondering, an abjad is like an alphabet, but by default does not encode vowels. And when it does encode vowels with letters, the letters are actually repurposed consonants. Aramaic and Arabic also use abjads.
So we're seeing evidences of workmanship, and workmanship is engineering-based.
Creationists, please learn that arguments from Scripture only work if the people you're talking to already accept the authority of those Scriptures in the way that you do. When you argue this way, it is very clear that you are not interested in being accepted in science, but only in keeping the flock that is already part of your narrow version of Christianity within the fold.
And so we're going back and we're treating organisms as if they really were designed. It showcases the wisdom and the genius of the Lord Jesus Christ, how he put these things together and he understands how they operate.
Except that Randy lacks a mechanism to explain adaptation in organisms, so all he's really doing is a silly thought experiment about what a designer would do if he had designed organisms, all without even showing the possibility of a designer doing anything when it comes to organisms.
And then we backed up a little bit and we found out that Darwin, when he started his theory of origin of the species, wasn't really trying to explain the diversity of life.
Weird then that that's what he did.
He's trying to explain the 900-pound gorilla in the room is why do creatures look so highly engineered, but without appealing to the ultimate engineer, the Lord Jesus Christ.
When Darwin was forming his idea around natural selection, he was a theist, and he was even apparently a Christian, although a Unitarian Christian. But it also doesn't matter. This is just guilt by association. If Darwin had bad motives, or his motives were solely to give praise to the Lord Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter. His ideas didn't make an impact because of his motives. They made an impact because of their scientific utility and the fact that they can't seem to be falsified, despite there being outcomes from observations that could falsify them.
In explaining all of those things, and he came about with an externalistic approach. But we flipped that 180 degrees, and we came up with a way of explaining organisms and how they adapt.
That doesn't have a mechanism that actually could possibly account for the changes we see routinely in the wild and in the lab.
From an engineered-based approach, an internalistic-based approach, and as you mentioned, it's called continuous environmental tracking.
Yes, we know. Get to the point.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
And there were a couple key distinctives about it. One is that CET is an organism-focused approach. In other words, we're not looking at the environment. We're looking inside of them. We're looking for highly regulated systems, control systems, that enable them to change. So that is a completely different approach than Darwin had. He looks at the environment. We're looking at the creatures. We're going to be using engineering principles to explain biological functions. In other words, in this particular case, the biological function is adaptation. So the same engineering principles which enable this car to go up and down hills and maintain its speed, in other words, adjust itself, are going to explain how organisms adapt.
I feel like he has said this over and over and over again. It's almost like there's nothing to continuous environmental tracking, and he knows it.
In other words, we're looking for sensors in creatures. We're looking for logic that says, if something changed, then I want to produce an appropriate response. And we're looking for output responses from them.
But that is also something he would expect if evolution were true. The question is, can Randy's mechanism go beyond epigenetics and actually induce genetic changes? Because we see such genetic changes in organisms. We can see the actual changes in the genetics of some of Randy's favorite organisms, like field and forest mice, cavefish, and beetles. Natural selection gets us genetic adaptation. So far, all Randy has pointed to is epigenetics, which do not result in changes to the genetic sequence, as well as phenotypic plasticity, which also does not result in changes to the genetic sequence. He needs another new mechanism, and it's going to almost certainly have to be some kind of induced mutation. But we already know experimentally that mutations are not induced by organisms as an adaptive response. The only way that mutations seem to be induced is horizontal gene transfer and mutations from radiation.
And therefore, we're able to look for corresponding system elements. We see a man-made adjustable car, and then we look at creatures that can adjust themselves to changes in environment. We're looking for corresponding elements between those two.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it!
We're looking for solutions that actually precede the challenges and are not due to the challenges, but precede the challenges.
But most challenges that an organism is going to face are going to be at least broadly similar to the challenges its ancestors faced. For example, while the current climate trend is, as near as we can tell, unprecedented, guinea pigs have encountered short-term climate fluctuations. And for an organism that normally can't even live a decade, a small-scale climate fluctuation could last a lifetime. epigenetic changes are themselves controlled by genetics and can evolve by natural selection. So evolutionary biology would predict that some organisms should have epigenetic mechanisms to help them survive and reproduce with a range of climates. Similarly, many organisms have predators, and introducing a new one will put new pressure on those organisms, but they already have anti-predation adaptations that will likely be of some use against new predators. Further, as we saw in the Luria-Delbruck experiment, the mutations that will allow for a population to adapt to a new selection pressure tend to exist in populations before the pressure even occurs, because the mutations are stochastic, and a large population will sample a high percentage of possible mutations. So again, Randy's idea struggles to actually make testable predictions that are both distinct from evolution and also not already falsified.
Do we have other examples? The critic might say, well, you guys have shown this one example here, but what else can we show?
As a critic, I would say that I have been shown 0 examples of anything that could possibly help Randy's crusade against natural selection.
What are some of the other things that will back up this CET approach?
Yes, we have some other examples there, and I'm going to talk about those. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to go to the board here and talk about them.
Let's do it.
So now, as we're looking at these different examples, we see from the scientific literature that adaptation isn't characterized at all like Darwin was thinking.
Isn't it strange how the people writing papers seem not to have noticed this? It's almost like all the people who have spent their lives working in this field have all missed something a guy with no training in the field noticed after faffing about a bit. Or I guess another option is that, like all of them insist, and even almost all creationists insist, Randy has absolutely no clue what he's talking about and is dead wrong. But hey, maybe these long-promised yet-to-be-delivered examples will shed more light on the problem.
As slow and gradual, but it's really characterized as highly regulated, very rapid.
So I want to take a second to talk about what we mean when we say that evolution is gradual. Let's take speed as an example. Say 10 kilometers per hour. Is that rapid? Well, if you're a snail, it sure is. But if you're a tuna fish, that's about as slow as you could reasonably go. Whether something is rapid or gradual is a matter of expectation, not an objective number. If a particular evolutionary change happens faster than expected, it's rapid. If it didn't, it's gradual. How fast is too fast? Well, we can actually get estimates based on effective population size, but we need to have good data on things like fitness effects of various alleles as well as population structure. Data which can be hard to get in the wild. In the fossil record, it's essentially impossible to get such data. In that case, whether the change is rapid or gradual can basically come down to how many intermediates we have and how abruptly they show up. Overall, evolution doesn't make a blanket prediction about whether evolution should be rapid or not, because that doesn't really mean something objective.
Sometimes repeatable and reversible.
This one is a little tricky to pick apart. There is a concept in evolutionary biology often called Dollo's law, which if taken at face value would seem to indicate that evolution cannot be reversed. But let's think about that. Every mutation that can occur could be reversed. A duplication could be deleted. A point mutation could be followed by a point mutation to the original nucleotide. So evolution can technically run in reverse. But since any particular mutation is unlikely on its own, it also follows that a back mutation is similarly unlikely. For example, if the chance for a particular mutation occurring were, say, 1 in a million, then the chance of that mutation occurring and subsequently being reversed is 1 in a trillion. As many mutations accumulate in a lineage, most are extremely unlikely to be reversed. And over time, it becomes essentially impossible to recover the ancestral state of the genome. In this way, Dollo's law is kind of like the second law of thermodynamics. It's not always strictly true, even in the areas where it applies, but because of the law of large numbers, it ends up being reliably and predictably true. So evolution can be reversed in the short term, especially if the originally dominant alleles were not completely erased from the population. But if we look at evolution from the standpoint of the morphology of a creature, rather than its genome, then reversing evolution is considerably more likely, especially when the evolution in question is relatively minor. Let's say that there is a species of bovine that lives in the steppes of a northern latitude. When the climate shifts to be colder, they grow bigger, and when it's warmer, they shift to be smaller, all because of concerns over food availability versus retaining heat. This change does not require exact back mutations in violation of Dollo's law. That is because most traits are controlled by multiple genes, and multiple different mutations to each gene can cause a similar effect on the phenotype of the creature. So there are many ways to mutate to be bigger, and many ways to mutate to be smaller. This is a predictable, repeatable pattern that still does not violate Dollo's law. Similarly, color or proportion of various body parts can swing back and forth or be repeated as a basal population enters separate environments, but that have similar selection pressure. For example, if our hypothetical bovine population had two populations split off and go further north, they would likely both increase in size. But in doing so, they would likely not have the same genetic cause for the increased size. We can even see this in humans. There are multiple genetic causes for lactase persistence in humans. That is the condition of not being lactose intolerant as an adult. They are geographically distributed with different people groups that have the trait having it for different genetic reasons. Now, Darwin probably would not have been able to predict this, because he had more or less no idea how inheritance works, and the very concept of a mutation had not been thought of yet, which is why evolutionary biology cannot reasonably be described as Darwinian anymore.
And with responses that are so targeted, they're actually predictable.
But convergent evolution, which is, near as I can tell what he's talking about, is predictable. There's a reason that basically every fast swimmer in the ocean is kind of shaped like a torpedo, and it's the same reason torpedoes are shaped that way too. It's hydrodynamics. Some geometries help something move quickly through the water, others hinder it. So if you need to go fast in the water, you need to be torpedo-shaped. Similarly, we see stripes all over the place in the wild because they tend to break up an animal's silhouette, and lots of things animals like to hide in, like plants, grow vertically, so stripes are a good way to blend in with such things. Further, if the changes Randy is talking about were just epigenetic, then of course they are predictable. They evolved in response to certain environmental stressors in particular ways. They're predictable in the same way anything else genetically determined is predictable.
And I want to cover a few examples, since you requested, of looking at how organisms sometimes converge on the same responses to similar conditions.
I feel like I just talked about that. Maybe I'm prescient. I'll need more geriatric spice to confirm.
And there's an excellent illustration here, as we look through it, of CET, that if organisms have sensors, and if they have the same internal logic that they're programmed with, then we should expect similar responses. In other words, if organisms are able to detect similar conditions, and their logic inside is very similar, then we will see those similar responses. Let me give you a quick example.
Finally, an actual example.
It's been 84 years.
Caves, what a challenging environment that is.
I was hoping for, an organism. But okay, let's hope he's talking about cave-dwelling or troglodytic organisms.
What happens if creatures suddenly find themselves trapped in a cave? Well, the organisms were meant to fill the earth, and that would include caves. So the designer, the engineer of the Lord Jesus Christ, probably built within them similar programming. And this is exactly what we find.
I wonder how you would test this. I suppose you could set up some identical simulated cave environments, then set some very genetically similar populations in several such environments, and see if they all get the same morphological adaptations, and then see if they all do it in about the same number of generations via the same mechanisms. That would be a test that could help demonstrate that something other than drift, selection, and mutation is at work. Somehow, though, I don't think he's done that.
We can look and we can see organisms that when they find themselves suddenly trapped in caves, they lose their eyes.
Right, but that's not enough. That organisms will lose their eyes is a prediction of both evolution and continuous environmental tracking. We need to have predictions that vary in order to test them. Well, I already provided one possibility of a different prediction. I wonder if Randy will have more.
We can see that their pigmentation changes. They go from a highly pigmented creature to a hypopigmented creature.
Randy has discovered that tanning is a thing.
Or in other words, one that's almost an albino.
No, albinos are genetically incapable of producing pigments. That's not always what happens to troglodytic organisms.
And they change their circadian rhythms. At the same time, as you would probably expect, they augment other senses, the mechanosensation, their sense of smell, and all of those things. And we're quite familiar that one creature that does this is the blind cavefish.
Specifically the Mexican tetra, which has several troglodytic populations, and which I happen to know that Randy really likes for reasons that escape me, since they seem to go beyond just being cool fish.
In other words, there's the surface fish, and when it's trapped in a cave, we find an albino, pinkish-looking fish without eyes. Evolutionists say they did that over anywhere from 8 million to 20,000 years ago, but we have evidence that they can actually make these changes quite rapidly.
Wow, I wonder if I'll see any evidence of this. He has said it a lot, and near as I can tell, I have never seen him actually produce this evidence, nor have I ever seen him provide a citation for where I could see it. I suppose maybe they're still working on writing a paper, but until that happens, he can't really say he has the evidence.
Remarkably, though, it's not just surface fish and cavefish, salamanders, crustaceans, and even insects respond in the same way.
But that's not remarkable at all. That's expected. Pigmentation is stimulated by light, and deep in the caves there isn't any. Further, the genetic mechanisms that maintain pigment production are subject to mutation, and if there is no purifying selection to keep such mechanisms in working order, they will break over time. Further, eyes cost a lot of energy to grow and maintain, and they are injury and infection prone. If the advantage of having them is gone as a result of there being no light, then the only selection pressure is to get rid of them. Cave-dwelling organisms will do better in a lightless environment with no eyes than with eyes, and by a substantial margin.
So if we're going to study these creatures from an engineering-based approach, we're going to look for those internal changes that enable to do that.
So the difference being, the evolutionists would say the cave actually over time and over different, random chance mutations, these creatures were produced by the cave.
I really don't think this distinction that they're making is even a real difference. Even if Randy is right, it's the cave that is providing the stimulus causing the organisms to change. No matter what, the organisms adapt to the cave because they're in the cave. The difference is whether the mechanism is a pre-established set of responses as the only mechanism, or whether some of the adaptation is a result of natural selection acting on mutation that themselves come about stochastically.
And we're saying no, what you actually find is when you study the creature itself has the ability in itself over a much shorter period of time to respond to its environment in such a way that it maximizes those things that give it an advantage in the cave, and then it minimizes those things that it doesn't need for the cave.
Exactly.
How is this guy seemingly so excited about this? Not a single experiment or observation in favor of this idea has been put forth. Not a single shred of evidence has been provided. Randy just came on the show, said, "Hey, wouldn't it be neat if X?" And this guy is all hyped up about X, even though there's not a single reason to think X is even possible. Never mind that the evidence shows it. The only thing I can think of is that this guy has his whole life just dominated by confirmation bias.
Perfect summary. That's exactly what we would find, and that's exactly what we would expect an engineer to do.
Yeah, I guess so, but, did he?
Here's another cool creature.
Oh, so we're just switching organisms? Okay, but I'm not switching organisms just yet. These fish are interesting, and I want to talk about them. So these fish are Mexican tetras, Astyanax mexicanus. Now, their pigment is indeed heavily influenced by the ambient light, but their eyesight is not. Mexican tetras are freshwater fish that live in both freshwater streams, but also in dozens of separate cave populations. The cave populations are all morphologically and behaviorally similar, being pale, eyeless, and also having reduced sleep, and generally little to no circadian rhythm. The interesting thing, though, is that all the populations of fish remain interfertile, which allows for research on their troglodytic adaptations to be done without the need to fully sequence their genomes. Not only do we know that the adaptations to cave life are genetic, and not epigenetic or due to phenotypic plasticity solely, with the partial exception of pigmentation, we know that the different cave-dwelling populations have different underlying genetic mechanisms for these traits. For example, crossbreeding separate eyeless fish populations can result in hybrid offspring that have perfectly normal eyes, just like those of the surface-dwelling tetras. This is because the mutations that cause the eyes not to form or to remain small and be covered in skin are different in different populations, and so when they are hybridized between the two parents, a full set of functional genes for eyes are present in the offspring, allowing them to develop eyes. But if you breed these hybrids among themselves, a large portion of the offspring will have small or no eyes again, and importantly, the lighting in the environment where these experiments are done does not matter, meaning that these fish are not losing their eyesight either as an internal response to light levels, nor are they doing it as a result of predictable directed mutation. Importantly, this means that the fish do not seem to all induce the same mutations for eyelessness, which would be the prediction from continuous environmental tracking. So we already are seeing problems with Randy's idea even from his own chosen example. Further, hybrids between surface and cave populations which occur in the wild have intermediate behavior, which is not itself correlated with light levels, but rather with recent ancestry, meaning that they show no particular evidence of tracking the light levels for purposes of knowing how much to sleep or not, at least not within a single or small number of generations. These cavefish are direct refutations of continuous environmental tracking, and direct evidence of mutation and selection being the driving force in evolution of troglodytic morphologies. I can't tell if the reason Randy uses these fish, despite them being a direct counterexample to his ideas, is just because he's so stupid that he can't tell what's going on, or if he just hasn't bothered to actually check the research on them, or if he's simply dishonest. I suppose I should also touch on the pigmentation bit. Essentially, pigmentation of these fish is only weakly heritable. But then that is also common in many animals, such as some humans. Many humans are very pale during the winter where there is little sun, but then they can become much darker in the summer as they tan, and in some cases tan lines can occur that directly show the difference in skin pigmentation between areas that typically do versus do not receive direct sunlight. These tetras have a similar condition. Exposure to light increases the pigmentation in their skin and scales, presumably for a similar reason it occurs in humans. to increase protection against ultraviolet light. This is an aspect of phenotypic plasticity. This does seem to be in line with continuous environmental tracking, but the problem is that it also is perfectly in line with evolutionary biology. The ability to acclimate within a single lifetime is itself a phenotype that can vary genetically and is subject to selection. But this is exactly why it's normally called acclimation and not adaptation. Another example is humans who live on the Tibetan Plateau. They have genetic adaptations to high elevation. But then if someone from a lowland area moves to a high elevation place, like Denver, Colorado, they will eventually acclimate, but they will never adapt in the evolutionary sense as an individual. This ultimately is the problem with continuous environmental tracking. It seems, near as I can tell, to have three necessary components: epigenetics, phenotypic plasticity, and induced mutations. The induced mutations are necessary because we know for a fact that the difference in the adaptation between at least some closely related organisms that even creationists would say share common ancestry is due to genetic changes, which means that epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity are out of the running as explanations. Epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity are well integrated into modern evolutionary biology, and so pointing to them does nothing to diminish the explanatory power of evolution or bolster continuous environmental tracking. All this together means that the only area of disagreement between continuous environmental tracking and evolution is in mutation. Evolutionary biology says that while not all mutations are equiprobable, they are all stochastic, that is, in colloquial terms, random, at least at the level that humans can study them. There may be some deep underlying physics that makes them fundamentally deterministic, but because those outcomes cannot be predicted reliably, they can be treated as random for the purposes of doing science about them. Continuous environmental tracking, however, requires that at least some mutations, especially those that increase the fitness in a lineage, are not stochastic, and instead are reliably predictable and are induced as a result of new environmental changes faced by the organism. Of course, as I have noted several times now, this directly contradicts the 80 or so year old findings of the Luria-Delbruck experiment, which directly tested the idea and then found that it was falsified. Ironically, these fish are themselves another test of induced mutation that could either confirm or falsify continuous environmental tracking. We know that particular genetic sequences are associated with the eyeless trait and the high rates of wakefulness in these tetras. If they are the result of internally induced mutations, then they should correlate very strongly with the environment and less strongly with ancestry in these fish. For example, hybrids of two cavefish populations grown in the dark should retain eyelessness, whereas those grown in light should consistently have eyes. Similarly, wild surface cave hybrids should have their wakefulness primarily determined by light levels. But that's not what is actually observed in these fish. Eyelessness and wakefulness are entirely driven by ancestry regardless of environment. Another thing to note is that, oddly enough, continuous environmental tracking is supposed to be less environmentally centered, and yet, if it were true, the actual morphology, biochemistry, and behavior of organisms should be very tightly correlated to the environment, often within only 1 or 2 generations, but that's not what we see. The traits of organisms are much more tightly correlated with ancestry than with environment. This is seen even in humans. As a result of colonialism, there are now large populations of humans primarily descended from Europeans living in the tropics, and in many cases they are many generations removed from their ancestors who were actually born in Europe. Yet these populations have not evolved a darker skin that would be more advantageous in these sunnier parts of the world, and so they are more susceptible to skin cancer and sunburn as a result of UV damage than the populations indigenous to these areas. Why have these humans not sensed the increased sunlight in their new environment and simply induced mutations to increase melanin production to the levels common in those who have already lived in these areas for tens of thousands of years? Somehow, despite Randy complaining that evolution is centered on the environment, it results in organisms that are far less controlled by the environment than would be predicted by continuous environmental tracking. At every turn, continuous environmental tracking is either absolute nonsense or has already been falsified. It's no wonder other creationists don't seem to want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Now, Randy is far from done, and he has other example organisms, but I think we will leave them for next time. For now, I'm going to take a break from Randy. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content, if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Phil Ravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elaround Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Ballus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.